Welcome back, my friends, to Faces of History, the place where we stand not just with the kings and rebels, but with the systems that ruled them, the walls that divided them, the lies that scarred them, and the courage that broke those walls down, brick by brutal brick. Tonight, pour yourself something warm or strong, because tonight we do not peer into a single face, but into millions. Tonight, we walk through the burning sun of South Africa, the townships, the cities, the rolling veldt, to stand in the shadow of a word that still shakes the heart: apartheid. Not a man, not a single villain in a dark palace, but a legal machine, forged from old colonial fear and cold calculations that locked away freedom with ink and laws, truncheons and bullets, passbooks and prison bars. Tonight we remember how it began, who shaped it, who enforced it, who resisted it, and how it finally fell, undone by children with stones, women who sang freedom songs, workers who stayed home from mines, and leaders who spent decades in tiny cells but whose spirits no iron bars could bend. So sit back, breathe deep, listen close, because in this story, every name matters, and the echoes still shape the world we stand in now. To understand the cruelty of apartheid, we must begin where every story begins: in childhood. The seeds of division were sown not just in the halls of parliament or the back rooms of power, but in the cradle and the classroom, in the playgrounds that were never shared, and the fences that rose higher than any child could climb. For Black South African children, a childhood under apartheid meant knowing from their first breath that freedom was rationed, and they were born owing a debt they could never repay. Born into the crowded townships of Soweto, Langa, or Sharpeville, many grew up in tin shacks or single-room hostels with no running water, no electricity, and no promise of tomorrow. In rural villages, the picture was no kinder. Entire families were uprooted by the Group Areas Act, bulldozers erasing Black neighborhoods overnight to make way for whites-only suburbs with manicured lawns and swimming pools their builders would never swim in. Generations lived in so-called homelands, barren scraps of land with poor soil, little infrastructure, and no hope of prosperity. These children learned early what their place was meant to be. They watched their parents carry passbooks like internal passports, flimsy pieces of paper that decided who could work, who could travel, and who could be dragged off by the police for stepping one street too far. A Black child might see their mother leave before dawn to scrub floors in the white part of town, returning after dark with aching hands and just enough coins to feed hungry mouths. School was no refuge. The Bantu Education Act made sure of that. Designed by Hendrik Verwoerd, the so-called architect of apartheid, this law ensured Black children would never learn enough to challenge white supremacy. Underfunded, overcrowded classrooms, outdated books, if there were books at all, and lessons drilled home one cruel fact: Black children were to be hewers of wood and drawers of water, destined for menial labor, cheap hands for white-owned mines and farms. And yet, in these same broken classrooms, seeds of rebellion grew. Children asked questions they were told never to ask. In June 1976, it was schoolchildren who rose up, thousands of students in Soweto marching against being forced to learn in Afrikaans, the language of their oppressors. They carried signs, they sang freedom songs, and they were met with bullets, children killed for daring to dream of a different future. But what of the white children? In the sun-drenched suburbs of Pretoria or the leafy streets of Cape Town, white children ran barefoot on wide lawns, rode bicycles on safe streets, and learned history that told them they were chosen, pioneers taming a savage land. Many grew up in homes where the Bible was read alongside tales of Boer ancestors, families who had fought the British Empire, trekked across the vast Karoo, and built a republic for their kin. In these homes, fear lurked behind lace curtains. Parents whispered of a Black majority that outnumbered them, and what might happen if the walls ever fell. This fear became faith in apartheid, taught at the dinner table, reinforced at school, preached from the pulpit. Boys like P.W. Botha were told they were the last line of defense for their people's survival, heirs of a harsh frontier spirit. Botha was born on a farm in the Orange Free State in 1916 when segregation was already stitched into the soil. He grew up hearing stories of his ancestors who trekked inland to escape British rule, proud Afrikaners who saw themselves as chosen to rule and separate. He learned that compromise was betrayal, that any threat to the white nation must be crushed before it could grow teeth. These childhoods did not excuse what men like Botha did, but they remind us. Cruelty is taught long before it is commanded. Apartheid did not grow in a vacuum. It was nurtured in nursery rhymes and Sunday sermons, in classroom maps that carved up a nation and minds alike. So there it was, two childhoods, side by side yet worlds apart. One learned obedience to a system designed to keep them small. The other learned to defend that system with all the guns, laws, and iron walls a fearful heart could build. And in the space between these children, a canyon of injustice bridged only by courage, rebellion, and the unyielding belief that one day the fences would fall. What makes a man hold another man in chains? What makes another stand up, shackles cutting into his skin, and say no more? To understand apartheid, we must look deeper than dusty laws and hollow speeches. We must peer into the hearts and hungers of the people who built it and those who broke it. For the architects of apartheid, fear was their clay. Take Hendrik Verwoerd, the so-called architect of apartheid. Born in Amsterdam in 1901, his family sailed south when he was just 2 years old, like so many Dutch settlers before them, searching for promise at the tip of Africa. Verwoerd grew up brilliant and calculating, a psychologist by training, a propagandist by instinct. He believed the white man's survival lay in keeping the black man separate, subjugated, and silent. Verwoerd saw apartheid not as cruelty, but as salvation for his people, a moral duty wrapped in pseudoscience. He wielded words like scalpels, talking of separate development, self-rule for black nations, when in truth, he was carving up souls, fencing off vast tracts of land, draining the wealth from black labor, while selling the lie of independence. For Verwoerd, apartheid was not simply policy, it was ideology, a faith passed down from his parents' fear of being overwhelmed, outnumbered, erased. When Verwoerd fell, assassinated in Parliament in 1966 by a disillusioned messenger, his blueprint did not die with him. Others carried his torch. P.W. Botha, Verwoerd's iron-fisted heir, came of age with the National Party's creed written into his marrow. Botha rose through the ranks, watching the old colonial order give way to a new threat, organized black resistance. Where Verwoerd was the cold scientist, Botha was the clenched fist. He saw conspiracies everywhere: communists, students, unions, foreign agitators. He ruled with emergency laws, secret police, torture chambers buried beneath Pretoria's gleaming government buildings. He told himself and his people that the chaos outside the razor wire justified every bullet fired at children, every protest crushed by armored trucks. But even monsters do not believe they are monsters. Botha pictured himself as a patriarch protecting his flock, never mind that the fences kept the rest of the nation in an open-air prison. Yet across the divide, the resistors were shaped by hope and fury in equal measure. Nelson Mandela was not born a revolutionary. He was born Roli Lala, troublemaker in Xhosa, in the rolling hills of the Transkei. His father, a respected advisor to the Thembu king, lost his land over a dispute with colonial authorities. Little Roli Lala watched his family's fortunes crumble under white rule. At a mission school, he tasted a Western education, but also the bitterness of being told he was less than human. As a young man, Mandela moved to Johannesburg, the city of gold, and found a different truth: a teeming metropolis of mines and slums, where black workers bled their youth into the earth, while white bosses built glass towers above them. Here, Mandela met the African National Congress, a movement of lawyers, teachers, and dreamers who spoke of freedom not as a slogan, but as a birthright. Mandela's fire was slow to spark. At first, he preached nonviolence. But when peaceful petitions were met with police dogs and gunfire, when children fell in Sharpeville and students died in Soweto, Mandela concluded that words alone could not topple the walls. In 1961, he co-founded Umkhonto we Sizwe, the Spear of the Nation, to sabotage the machinery of apartheid: bombs, boycotts, strikes, not terror for its own sake, but a strike against tyranny, a message to the world that the oppressed would no longer kneel. Why did so many ordinary people comply? Apartheid did not survive on leaders alone. It thrived in the minds of millions who called themselves just ordinary. The police who swung batons in dusty streets, the clerks who stamped passbooks, The judges who condemned men to rob an island all told themselves they were cogs in a necessary machine. Many white South Africans were taught that any alternative meant anarchy, that the loss of white rule would bring ruin to their homes, their families, their fragile place in Africa. Fear of losing privilege bound them tighter than any iron law. And so the lies hardened into belief that segregation was natural, that black South Africans were better off kept apart, that without apartheid, the land would be swallowed by chaos. Fear is an ancient drug. It dulls the conscience. It makes cruelty seem like common sense. Yet what made the freedom fighters stand when surrender would have been safer? It was the belief that no chain could bind the spirit forever. Steve Biko, a young leader who never lived to see apartheid's fall, said, "The most potent weapon in the hands of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed." So Biko taught black South Africans to believe in themselves again, black consciousness, to reclaim their minds before reclaiming their streets. For this, Biko was tortured to death in a Pretoria cell at the age of 30. Winnie Madikizela Mandela, Nelson's wife, the mother of the nation, spent decades harassed, banished, imprisoned, separated from her children. But she did not bend. She raised a generation in Soweto who learned that defiance is a duty passed down like a family name. So what made them do what they did? The answer is as old as power and pride. Fear for some, hope for others. Greed for some, dignity for others. Some clung to the chains because they feared what freedom would cost them. Others broke the chains because they feared what slavery would cost their souls. And in that struggle, human hearts against iron bars, the true face of apartheid was laid bare for the world to see. Apartheid was not a single blow. It was 1,000 daily cuts, 1,000 invisible walls. It did not come with the sudden thunder of tanks or the overnight roar of a coup. It arrived like a slow poison, administered through laws, offices, uniforms, and paper stamped with the government's cold seal. It began in 1948 when the National Party came to power and made segregation the law of the land. But the roots reached further back, to centuries of Dutch and British rule, to frontier wars and colonial conquest, to mines that swallowed men whole for diamonds and gold that never lined black pockets. Apartheid codified this cruelty with clinical precision. The architects of this system did not merely separate people by skin, they separated families, communities, dreams. First, they measured you. Under the Population Registration Act of 1950, every South African was classified: white, black, colored, Indian. Bureaucrats decided who you were, sometimes by measuring the curl of your hair, the shape of your nose, the color of your fingernails. A child with fairer skin than his siblings could be reclassified, tearing families apart at the stroke of a pen. An uncle suddenly declared colored might be banished from a black homeland or forced out of a white area overnight. Next, they moved you. The Group Areas Act tore people from homes their ancestors had built. Neighborhoods like Sophia Town in Johannesburg and District 6 in Cape Town were razed to the ground. Bulldozers flattened houses while families watched helplessly, possessions piled high on dusty roadsides. Millions were forced into townships on the margins of cities, far schools, hospitals, jobs. These places, Soweto, Khayelitsha, Alexandra, grew into sprawling grids of tin shacks and matchbox houses built by the hands of the displaced. There was no clean water, no safe streets, no future promised. Yet from these streets came the heartbeat of resistance, the songs, the protests, the young people who would one day pull the system down. Then they controlled your movement. The past laws were apartheid's daily chokehold. Every black adult had to carry a passbook that recorded where they could go, where they could work, when they could leave their designated area. At any moment, police could demand it. Forget your passbook, and you could be arrested, fined, thrown into prison, or deported back to a homeland you'd never seen. Pass raids were common. Police trucks would sweep through cities like ghost hunters, dragging men and women from factories, trains, sidewalks, demanding papers. It turned daily life into a constant fear. A journey to work could end in a jail cell. A father who forgot his pass could vanish for weeks, leaving a family to starve. The Bantu Education Act ensured that black children would never be given the same tools as white children. Verwoerd, the so-called father of this twisted doctrine, put it plainly: there is no place for the Bantu in the European community above certain forms of labor. Schools for black children were overcrowded, underfunded, sometimes without desks, books, or toilets. Teachers were poorly paid, many barely trained. Children learned how to obey, not how to dream. They learned how to take orders, not how to give them. And when they dared to demand better, as they did in 1976, when thousands of school children marched through Soweto chanting, "Down with Afrikaans," the state responded with bullets. That uprising left hundreds of children dead. The photographs of young Hector Peterson's lifeless body, carried by a fellow student through streets of tear gas, shocked the world but did not stop the killings. They policed your thoughts. Apartheid had watchmen in every shadow. The state controlled newspapers, banned books, censored songs. It outlawed political parties like the ANC and the Pan-Africanist Congress, driving leaders underground or into exile. Activists were detained without trial, tortured in cold concrete cells. Some, like Steve Biko, were beaten to death, their murders thinly covered with lies about hunger strikes or self-inflicted injuries. Neighbors turned informer. A careless word could cost you your job or your life. Families learned to speak in whispers, to glance over shoulders, to hide pamphlets beneath floorboards. The price of courage was exile, prison, or the grave. Yet cruelty needs labor to feed it. Apartheid's economy was built on black backs. Black men were herded into labor hostels, prison-like barracks far from families, to dig gold from the earth, to cut coal, back to build the cities they could never freely live in. Women labored as domestic workers in white suburbs, raising other people's children while their own were left behind in distant villages. Profit flowed up the chain to white mine owners, factory bosses, and the state. Resistance was met with brutal crackdowns. Strikes were illegal, trade unions were banned or infiltrated. Yet workers kept organizing, underground in whispers with secret meetings by candlelight. And yet, amid this cruelty, life refused to die. Townships erupted with music, defiance woven into jazz, gospel, protest songs that traveled by cassette tape and word of mouth. Families held each other together with laughter that rose stubbornly from kitchens and dusty streets. Children danced, poets wrote verses no censor could erase. Old freedom fighters mentored the young. The state's cruelty was relentless, but so was the spirit of the people it tried to break. Apartheid was not just a policy. It was a machinery of daily humiliation, built by men who told themselves they were civilized. It was classrooms without books, streets without hope, fathers who never came home, mothers who scrubbed floors until their hands bled, children who learned to duck tear gas before they learned to read. But it was also the furnace that forged a generation unbowed. A system that taught cruelty, taught resistance, too. For every law meant to separate, a song rose to unite. For every baton, a stone was thrown. For every prison door slammed shut, a mind walked free. In the cruel reality of apartheid, we find the worst of what man can do, but also the stubborn heartbeat of what man can endure. History loves to end its darkest chapters with neat conclusions. Tyrants toppled, justice served, wounds healed. But the truth, the real truth, is rarely so tidy. Apartheid's architects did not vanish in the night, nor did they all stand in courtrooms, heads bowed, to answer for the blood on their hands. Some died defiant, some died alone, some died believing they were right to the bitter end. Hendrik Verwoerd, the so-called architect of apartheid, he built the scaffolding, he wrote the blueprints for separate development. He dreamed of a country carved up like a butcher's block. Black South Africans forced into impoverished Bantustans, hollow puppet states with no power, so that white rule could appear benevolent to the watching world. Verwoerd rose from professor to minister of native affairs. The cold hand that wrote the Bantu Education Act, the pass laws, the language decrees that sparked revolt. Then, in 1958, he became prime minister, the most powerful man in a country suffocating under his vision. But the father of apartheid did not die of old age. On September 6, 1966, inside the all-white parliament in Cape Town, Verwoerd sat at his desk, believing himself untouchable. He did not see the hand of Dimitri Tsafendas, a parliamentary messenger, part Greek, part Mozambican, slip a knife from his coat. Tsafendas stabbed Verwoerd 4 times in the chest. Verwoerd collapsed on the green leather benches he once ruled from, the blood of apartheid's engineer seeping into the carpet. He was 64. Tsafendas was declared insane and locked away for the rest of his life. Some said he was mad. Others whispered that he was simply a man driven to desperation in a country that would never have heard his voice otherwise. Verwoerd's death did not kill apartheid, it simply passed the torch. P.W. Botha, the big crocodile. Where Verwoerd drafted the plans, Peter Willem Botha enforced them with a soldier's discipline and a patriarch's stubbornness. Born in 1916, Botha rose through the National Party zealot climbing a steeple. He served as Minister of Defense, overseeing South Africa's ruthless military machine as it crushed uprisings and struck at neighboring countries that dared to shelter ANC fighters. In 1978, Botha became Prime Minister and later the first executive state president. By then, the world had turned its eye on South Africa's abuses. Sanctions bit deep. Boycotts grew louder. Protesters chanted Mandela's name from London to Harlem to Sydney, but Botha refused to blink. He declared repeated states of emergency. Townships burned under curfews and tanks. Newspapers were shut. Trade unions were raided. Activists vanished into police cells where confessions were forced with fists, boots, and electric wires. Yet even the big crocodile could not hold back the river forever. Under immense internal and global pressure, Botha cracked the door open, just slightly, lifting bans on some political activities, freeing a few prisoners. But he would not free Mandela, not fully dismantle the machinery he spent a lifetime defending. He called himself a reformer. Many called him an old guard in disguise. In 1989, a stroke forced Botha to resign. He retreated to his coastal home in Wilderness near George, living out his final days under the same wide South African sky he'd once tried to control. He died in 2006, aged 90, surrounded by loyalists, never prosecuted for the state killings, torture, or terror he unleashed. He never apologized. When asked if he regretted his part in apartheid, he scoffed, "I did what was necessary for my people." And so he died, unrepentant. The world turned the page without him. Eugène Terre Blanche, the last gasp of white supremacy. To speak of apartheid's ringleaders is to remember those who carried its torch even after the official flag came down. Eugène Terre Blanche, leader of the Afrikaner Weerstandsbeweging, AWB, styled himself a white knight of Afrikanerdom. He rode horses at rallies, wore military uniforms, and brandished the old Nazi-like swastika of his movement. When the negotiations for a democratic South Africa began, Terre Blanche tried to stop them with bombs and threats. He dreamed of a whites-only Volksstaat, a fantasy that never took root. When Mandela walked free, when the first black votes were cast, Terre Blanche faded to a fringe figure, more a ghost than a general. In 2010, the last page turned for him too. Terre Blanche was found bludgeoned to death on his farm, killed by two black farm workers in a dispute over unpaid wages. Even in death, his story was tangled with the same bitterness and blood that fed his life. And what of the liberators? Some lived to see the sun rise on a free South Africa. Nelson Mandela, prisoner 46664, the man whose image was banned for decades, emerged from Robben Island after 27 years, his fist raised, his spirit unbroken. He chose reconciliation over revenge, forging the Truth and Reconciliation Commission to pull the poison from the wound instead of burying it deeper. He served one term as South Africa's first black president, then stepped aside, his place in history secured not by power, but by grace. Mandela died in 2013, mourned not only by South Africa, but by millions across the world, a statesman who walked out of a cell and into legend. Others were not so lucky. Steve Biko never saw freedom, murdered at 30 in a Pretoria cell. Chris Hani, leader of a South African Communist Party and a fierce voice for the poor, was assassinated in his driveway in 1993, his blood almost derailing the fragile transition to democracy. Winnie Madikizela Mandela outlived her husband's prison years, but carried scars of battles won and battles lost, a complicated legacy of resistance and rage that still divides opinions to this day. Apartheid's ringleaders thought they could write an ending where their names would stand tall, carved into marble as the guardians of their nation's soul. But history is merciless. Today, their statues stand cracked and vandalized, their portraits gathering dust in back rooms of government archives. Their ideas remembered only as warnings. Lessons for every generation that power hoarded through fear will one day crumble under the weight of its own cruelty. But the legacy of apartheid itself lives on, not in the men who built it, but in the structures they left behind. A nation still battles poverty drawn along old racial lines. Economic freedom lags behind political freedom. Land and wealth remain stubbornly unequal. The scars are visible in townships still sprawling outside the cities, in schools still underfunded, in families still searching for dignity, stolen decades ago. Yet the other legacy, the greater one, is the will to keep going. The children who marched in Soweto live on in new generations who demand better. Mandela's long walk to freedom did not end at the ballot box. It continues every day in courtrooms, classrooms, and streets where people still rise, still speak, still believe. So how did they die? Some by violence, some by nature's slow hand, some by the weight of history's contempt. But the question is not only how they died, it is how we live with what they left behind. That, my friends, is our inheritance and our burden to remember the cruelty of man, so we might choose every day to be kinder than those who came before. Time is a cunning thief. It steals the sharp edges of memory, softens horror into history, folds tragedy into textbooks and museums. But apartheid, the cruelty of man cast in laws and concrete, will not stay politely in the past. Its shadows stretch long across the 21st century. Its fingerprints linger in places far beyond South Africa's borders. So why does apartheid matter today? Why must we still say its name like a ghost at the table? Because its bones are still buried beneath our feet. Walk through Johannesburg or Cape Town, and you will see two cities stacked atop one another. In one city, the suburbs sprawl wide with green lawns and high walls topped with electric fences, relics of old fear retooled for new crimes. In the other, townships spread to the horizon, rows of tin shacks, pit toilets, power lines tangled like spider webs. Apartheid engineered these fault lines so precisely that tearing them out has proven harder than tearing down a single regime. The Group Areas Act may be dead on paper, but its consequences live on in property deeds and generational wealth. Who owns the land? Who owns the mines? Who sits in the boardrooms and who digs in the dust? The passbooks were burned, the signs reading "whites only" torn down, but the deep architecture of injustice, the hidden skeleton, remains stubborn. Schools in poor Black communities still receive fewer resources than elite institutions behind gates and guards. Hospitals in townships buckle under the weight of patients. Private hospitals flourish a few miles away. Because the struggle did not vanish with the ballot box. In 1994, South Africa voted as one nation for the first time. A rainbow flag replaced the old apartheid banner. Nelson Mandela stood before the world not as prisoner, but as president, and for a moment, hope felt unstoppable. Yet democracy alone does not heal centuries of stolen opportunity. Corruption, crime, and political betrayal have left many disillusioned. The generation born free, the born frees, grows up asking why so many promises remain unfulfilled. They inherit freedom, but not always the means to build better lives. Apartheid's legacy teaches us that voting alone is never enough. True freedom, freedom that feeds children, shelters families, educates minds, heals wounds, demands vigilance and struggle that outlasts any single leader. Because the tools of apartheid did not stay in South Africa. Apartheid was not an isolated monster, it was a blueprint. The idea that people can be divided, measured, boxed, ranked, and ruled by fear is as old as empires and as new as tomorrow's headline. In Palestine, the word apartheid echoes in debates about walls, checkpoints, and segregated roads. In the United States, echoes of segregation linger in redline neighborhoods, prison pipelines, and schools divided by wealth and zip code. Around the world, systems of oppression reinvent themselves with new slogans, but the DNA is the same. Us versus them, walls over bridges, power hoarded by the few. Apartheid reminds us that once injustice is coded into law, it does not politely erase itself. It mutates. It digs into institutions, economies, the marrow of society, and it takes generations of vigilance to root it out. Because resistance is a living inheritance. If apartheid's cruelty still matters, so does the courage that brought it down. The world watched as black South Africans, colored South Africans, Indian South Africans, and a few white allies who risked exile or prison rose up in defiance. They boycotted buses, organized strikes, smuggled banned leaflets, sheltered comrades on the run. Teenagers who should have been giggling in schoolyards learned to dodge tear gas and rubber bullets. Mothers who should have rocked babies to sleep instead stood in front of tanks, singing freedom songs with cracked voices. This defiance rippled outward to anti-colonial struggles across Africa, to civil rights movements in America, to any place where the oppressed dared whisper, "We are not alone." Today, their legacy is a blueprint too. For every protester who kneels, every student who chants, every worker who stands up to power. Apartheid's fall reminds us that injustice, no matter how fortified, is never invincible. It falls when people refuse to be afraid, because remembering is a shield against repetition. There will always be those who say, "Let the past rest. Let the dead bury the dead. Why dig up old ghosts?" But ghosts do not stay buried when their work is unfinished. Forgetting apartheid's cruelty is the first step to allowing it, or something like it, to return. So we say their names, we tell their stories, we stand in the shadow of that word, apartheid, not to bow before it, but to learn how it was built, how it bled a nation dry, and how it was broken apart by people who refused to bow in return. Apartheid matters because it is proof, written in laws, blood, and songs, of what human beings are capable of when fear reigns, and what they are capable of when courage stands up to fear. It matters because we still carry its inheritance, a reminder that justice is not a single triumph, but a lifelong fight, that freedom must be tended like a fragile garden, or the weeds of old cruelties will reclaim the soil. So tonight, remember this word, remember this cruelty, remember the millions who lived and died under its shadow, and the millions more who live today in the long echo of its fall. Because history's cruelty is never just history, it is a mirror. And it dares us to ask, what will we do differently now that we know? So here we stand at the end of this night's long road through townships and boardrooms, classrooms and prison cells, courtrooms and graves. We have seen how the cruel machinery of apartheid was assembled bolt by bolt, law by law, and how that same machinery, once thought unbreakable, buckled beneath the relentless hammer of human courage. We have walked beside children who learned to read by candlelight, who learn to fight before they learn to drive, who learn that freedom sometimes costs everything you have, and sometimes your very life. We have sat in the shadow of men who dreamed themselves architects of eternity, only to find their monuments cracked by truth, their legacies haunted by the same ghosts they tried to bury. We have traced the scars that apartheid left behind, the invisible lines that still divide cities and schools and futures long after the last passbook turned to ash. And we have felt the pulse that beats in every heart that whispers, never again. Tonight's story is not just South Africa's story. It is the story of every place where power builds walls instead of bridges. It is the story of every people who have ever been told they are less than human, and every soul that ever stood up to say, "I am more." It is a reminder, carved into stone, stitched into song, buried in unmarked graves, that justice is never handed down from thrones or parliaments. It is taken, seized by the hands of the brave, the stubborn, the desperate, the hopeful. So when you wake tomorrow, in whatever part of the world you call home, remember that the cruelty of man is not ancient history. It is a warning flare on the horizon. It is the voice that asks you, what will you build? What will you tear down? What will you do to make sure that no child ever has to march through tear gas just to claim the birthright of being human? Faces of History is not here to comfort you. It is here to remind you that names matter, stories matter, and how we carry them forward matters most of all. So hold this story close, pass it on, speak it aloud where silence tries to swallow it, teach it to your children that apartheid did not end because cruelty grew tired. It ended because people, ordinary and extraordinary, refused to bow. And tonight, I stand in the echo of a word that once ruled millions: apartheid. May we remember it not as chains to bind us, but as proof that no chain is stronger than the will to break it. Until next time, my friends, walk free, stand tall, remember well. Good night.